Some goodbyes are spoken, sealed with a final glance, a last touch, a whispered farewell. But others linger, unspoken, unfinished, a wound that time cannot heal. He never got the chance to say goodbye. One moment, she was there, a part of his world, and the next she was gone. No last words, no closure, just an emptiness that followed him through the years. But some goodbyes don't need words. Some find their way back in the echoes of the past, waiting to be heard. The morning had been like any other, uneventful, routine, forgettable. He had scrolled past her name on his phone, intending to call back later. Later. That word felt heavier now, weighted with regret. Later never came. The news had hit him in the most ordinary way possible. A message, a call, a few words strung together that changed everything. He had read them, heard them, but they didn't sink in. They couldn't be real. People don't just vanish like that, not without warning, not without a chance to say goodbye. But she was gone. He sat at his desk, staring at his phone, fingers hovering over her name, knowing there would never be an answer. A part of him still expected to hear her voice, to receive a message filled with laughter and warmth. The silence that met him was unbearable. The weight in his chest grew heavier as the day went on. He moved through the motions, nodding when expected, breathing without thinking, but inside, nothing felt real. He had replayed their last conversation so many times that the words blurred together, overlapping, changing in his mind. "I'll call you later." She had said it first. He had repeated it back. It was nothing, just a casual goodbye. But now it was everything. His fingers gripped the edge of his desk. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to force away the ache that had settled deep in his bones. He should have called. He should have said something more. But regret was a cruel companion. It whispered only what could never be changed. The funeral came too quickly, yet dragged on endlessly. People spoke in hushed voices, their words blending together in a blur of sorrow. He stood at a distance, unable to move closer, as if stepping forward meant accepting that this was real. Someone touched his arm. A friend? A relative? He wasn't sure. Their words washed over him, meaningless. He nodded, pretending to listen, pretending to be present. But all he could hear was her voice in his head, the last time they had spoken, the last words they had exchanged. The service ended. People drifted away, lost in their own grief, their own memories. He remained behind, staring at the headstone, at the name carved into the stone. It looked wrong. It wasn't supposed to be there. The wind carried a whisper, a sound that could have been the rustling of leaves or the remnants of a voice he would never hear again. He inhaled sharply, the chill settling deep inside him. There was so much left unsaid. He crouched down, fingers grazing the cold stone. His throat tightened. "I didn't get to say goodbye," he whispered. The words felt empty, meaningless in the face of reality. But they were all he had left. He stayed there as the sky darkened, unwilling to move, afraid that if he left, he would lose the last traces of her. But deep down, he knew he had already lost her, and the goodbye that never came would haunt him forever. The days blurred together, indistinguishable from one another. Time moved forward, indifferent to the weight pressing against his chest. The world expected him to heal, to wake up, to function, but he was stuck in the moment she left, trapped in the unfinished conversation, in the words that had never been spoken. He found himself reaching for his phone more often than he cared to admit. His fingers would hover over her name, lingering on the screen as if she might suddenly reply, as if a message would come through, telling him this was all some mistake. But the screen remained empty. The silence stretched, heavy and endless. He stopped sleeping properly. When he closed his eyes, she was there, not in the way he wanted, not in the way that brought comfort. Instead, she existed in the spaces between his dreams, a shadow at the edge of his consciousness, a whisper he could never quite hear. Memories came in flashes. The way she laughed, the way she would roll her eyes at him, the way she spoke like she had all the time in the world. And yet, she hadn't. The thought made his stomach twist. One night, unable to bear the silence of his apartment, He went for a walk. The streets were empty, save for the occasional car passing by. The city felt unfamiliar, too quiet, too vast. He walked without direction, letting the cold air bite at his skin, hoping the numbness would settle the storm inside him. Then, without realizing it, his feet led him to a familiar place. Her favorite coffee shop. It was closed, the chairs stacked on the tables, the lights dim inside. He stood outside, staring through the glass, remembering the last time they had been here. She had been talking about something. What was it? He couldn't remember. But he could still see the way she stirred her coffee, the way she had smiled at him like she had all the time in the world. The weight in his chest grew heavier. He pressed his fingers against the glass, his breath fogging up the surface. She had been here. She had existed. And now she was just gone. Turning away, he shoved his hands into his pockets and kept walking. He ended up by the river, the water reflecting the glow of the streetlights. He leaned against the railing, staring at his own reflection, barely recognizing himself. He let out a hollow laugh. "You are always better at saying goodbye than me," he murmured, knowing no one was there to hear it. A breeze swept past him, sending a shiver down his spine. He pulled his jacket tighter around himself, exhaling a shaky breath. He wasn't sure how long he stood there, lost in his own thoughts, but when he finally turned to leave, something stopped him. A sound. Faint. Almost like a whisper. He froze. His heart pounded in his chest as he glanced around. No one. Just the wind. Just the river. Just his mind, playing tricks on him. And yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. That something lingered. Maybe it was nothing. Or maybe, just maybe, some goodbyes didn't need to be spoken. Maybe they found their way through the silence. The days continued to slip through his fingers, but the weight in his chest never lessened. It was always there, silent, suffocating, waiting. Grief was not loud. It did not demand attention. It lived in the quiet spaces, in the pause before he spoke, in the empty seat across from him at the cafe, in the way his fingers still hesitated over her name in his phone. But that whisper, that faint, almost imperceptible sound by the river, had stayed with him. He told himself it had been the wind, the restless city at night, his own mind playing tricks. And yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had been left unfinished. One evening, long after the sun had set, he found himself in his apartment, staring at the unopened box in the corner of his room. It had been given to him by her family, a collection of things she had left behind, things they thought he should have. He had refused to open it at first, unwilling to confront the memories trapped inside. But now, something pulled him toward it. He knelt down, running his fingers along the edge of the cardboard before finally peeling the tape away. The flaps opened with a soft rustle, revealing a mess of items inside. A worn-out hoodie he had once teased her about always stealing, a book with dog-eared pages, a half-empty bottle of perfume that still carried her scent. His hands trembled as he picked up a small leather notebook. He recognized it immediately. She had always carried it, scribbling down thoughts, quotes, lists of places she wanted to visit. He hesitated before flipping it open, the pages delicate beneath his fingertips. Her handwriting stretched across them, familiar and full of life. Random notes, half-finished thoughts, small doodles in the margins. He traced his finger over her words, drinking them in, searching for something, anything, that would make her feel closer. Then he turned to the last page, and his breath caught in his throat. "If I don't get to say goodbye, promise me you'll still remember. Not the ending, not the sadness, but the moments that mattered. The way we laughed, the way we dreamed. We never say goodbye, not really. We just carry each other forward." His vision blurred. His hands gripped the notebook so tightly his knuckles turned white. She had known. Somewhere deep inside, she had known that time was never guaranteed, that goodbyes weren't always spoken aloud. And yet, she hadn't been afraid. He closed his eyes, pressing the notebook against his chest, holding it as if it could bring her back. The wind outside picked up, rattling the window pane. And in that moment, as he sat in the quiet of his apartment, he swore he heard it again, a whisper. Soft. Gentle. like a farewell that had finally found its way to him. He inhaled shakily, feeling something shift within him. For the first time, the weight in his chest didn't feel quite as heavy. The wind rattled the window pane again, but this time, he didn't flinch. He sat frozen on the floor, his fingers gripping the notebook, his mind spinning. The words she had written echoed in his head, looping endlessly. We never say goodbye, not really. We just carry each other forward. It wasn't just a thought. It wasn't just something she had scribbled down without meaning. She had meant it. She had written it for herself, maybe for him too, maybe for anyone who had ever struggled with loss. His fingers traced the ink, feeling the grooves of her writing, as if he could somehow hold onto her through the words she left behind. His chest ached. For so long, he had clung to the absence of her, the spaces she left behind, the silence, the things that would never be said. But now, as he sat in the dim glow of his apartment, surrounded by the remnants of her life, he realized something. She was never really gone, not in the way he had feared. She was still here, not as a whisper in the wind, not as a ghost haunting the edges of his mind, but in every single memory they had shared. His breath hitched, and before he could stop himself, a sob tore through him. It was raw, deep, the kind that had been buried for too long. His body trembled as the weight of everything he had been carrying finally broke. Tears slipped down his face, dripping onto the pages of the notebook, smudging the ink ever so slightly. But he didn't move. He let himself feel it, all of it. For the first time, he didn't try to silence his grief. He let it exist. Let it breathe. The wind outside softened, as if the world itself was exhaling with him. Minutes passed. Maybe hours. He didn't know. But when he finally wiped his face, when he finally took a deep, shuddering breath, something inside him felt lighter. He ran his fingers through his hair, his body exhausted, but his heart steady. He closed the notebook gently, holding it in his lap, his fingers lingering on the cover. And then, for the first time in months, he smiled. It was small, faint, but real. He would carry her forward. Not in sadness, not in regret, but in love. She had never needed a goodbye. And now neither did he. The morning light filtered through his window, soft and golden, painting the walls with a warmth he hadn't felt in a long time. It was strange, waking up without the familiar weight pressing down on his chest. It wasn't that the grief had disappeared, but it had changed. It no longer felt like a chain, pulling him backward, trapping him in a moment that had long since passed. Instead, it was something quieter, something lighter. He sat up slowly, running a hand through his hair. His eyes landed on the notebook resting on his nightstand. He had placed it there the night before, unwilling to let it out of his sight. He reached for it now, fingers grazing the worn leather cover. Opening it again, he reread her words. We never say goodbye, not really. We just carry each other forward. A deep breath. The air felt different in his lungs, as if he was breathing fully for the first time in months. For so long, he had clung to the idea that closure meant saying goodbye, that healing meant forgetting. But now, as he traced the letters she had left behind, he understood. Goodbyes weren't always necessary. She would always be with him. Not in a painful way. Not in a way that held him captive. But in the small, quiet moments. In laughter shared with friends. In the songs they used to sing along to in the car. In the way the autumn breeze felt against his skin, carrying the scent of the world moving forward. The loss would always be there, but it no longer felt like a wound. It was just love. Love that had nowhere to go. He got up, stretching his sore muscles, and for the first time in months, he felt ready. Not to move on, but to live. The day passed with an ease he didn't expect. He went through the motions, making coffee, answering messages, stepping outside without the usual hesitation. The world hadn't changed, but something inside him had. That evening, he found himself walking toward the river again. The same place where he had first heard the whisper in the wind, the place where his grief had felt unbearable. But tonight it was different. The water shimmered under the streetlights, reflecting the quiet hum of the city. He pulled the notebook from his pocket, running his fingers over the pages one last time before carefully tucking it away. Then he exhaled. He wasn't waiting for a sign anymore. He wasn't searching for words that would never be spoken. He had them now. And so, standing beneath the vast open sky, with the sound of the river flowing beside him, he whispered the only words that mattered. I'll carry you with me, not as a ghost, not as a memory of sorrow, but as love that never fades. And for the first time, that was enough.